You know, we've spoken in previous episodes, Patrice, about how there's been such an increase in hate and violence over these past 4 years. The recent hate crimes and tragedies are just really more clear examples of the danger facing marginalized communities. So what are some examples of how Not in Our Town groups or branches across the country take action against fighting hate?
First, let me set the stage a little bit and say that one of the most important things we need to do is build relationships and get a handle on how many hate crimes are happening, right? Mm-hmm. Our Asian brothers and sisters are in deep fear now because these elders are being harmed. They're afraid to go out of their houses. You know, the dangers of hate are often uncounted. And we know this by looking at statistics. So I'm just going to geek out a minute, but it's really important to understand this. So every year, the FBI files the official report, and they say, we estimate in any given year somewhere between 6,000 and 9,000 hate crimes happened. And they count them and they count them up. And that's based on what local law enforcement reports to the FBI. There's another arm of Department of Justice, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, that uses a different way to measure them, and they estimate that at least 250,000 or more hate crimes happen every day. So in the middle of that, there is so much pain and trauma. There's so much that we don't even know, the harm that is taking place that we don't know. So, you know, trying to understand that and build those kind of relationships so people feel safe to report hate incidents before they turn into hate crimes. Because it could be, I remember we were working with one town and they were talking about a woman who was jogging, and, you know, every time she drove by a certain house, that someone would come out and say, go back to where you came from, and they would scream this at her. And the harm of that, right, the harm of those racist messages on people cannot be underestimated, right? That may not have been a hate crime, that may have been protected speech, but she carries that for a long time. And, you know, the largest number of hate crimes are racially based hate crimes. The highest, the population is most targeted is Black people in our country, right? And people of color. But that is not to diminish the hate crimes against LGBTQ people, people based on their religion, whether they're Jewish or Muslim or Sikh or Hindu. I mean, hate across the board. And if you look at how it's defined in the hate crime statute, it's targeting someone for their identity based on race, religion, gender, or disability. And I think sort of keeping that as a frame so you don't say, oh, I hate you because you're, you know, you disagree with me about X, Y, Z. Hate, as we define it, is based on identity. You could be walking down the street and someone identifies you correctly or not and then chooses to harm you or target you. So I guess successful. What's successful? First of all, the groups that are most successful have built relationships over time. They get to know each other and they create an atmosphere in their town where people feel safe, where there are conversations where people feel safe to report what's happened to them, and they declare, like, when you say not in our town, well, first of all, people are saying, why is your name so negative? And it's like, I don't know, we named our film that. Our film was called Not in Our Town, and it was based on a sign on a sporting goods store in Billings, Montana. And it said, no hate, no fear, no violence, not in our town. And we thought that was a really good name for the movie. And then communities took it on. But then I think we've gotten some response that people use the name because it declares, you know, we do not want hate in our town. At the same time, I think the affirmation is important as well. What do we want? We want to build a safe, inclusive community, right? And so we need to define what that means. What does it mean for everyone to feel safe? Right? What is that? Safe from the harm that we talked about earlier of being called a name or identified and facing a harm, the harm of racism or intolerance or bigotry that you can carry with you the rest of your life. This is a public health issue. This is, you know, this kind of harm is so understudied. And so when we get it out in the open in our communities, when we make a place to say, not in our town, we stand for safe, inclusive communities, we begin the process of building a set of shared values in our town that say, yeah, that's who we are. We are a community that's safe and inclusive for everyone. And then you have to start taking the steps and really listening to people about what that means. What is unsafe for people? Where are the places that are unsafe? And it really does start with relationships and building a sort of a group that holds and is responsible for carrying this work forward, right? And there will be people that come in and out of it. But the groups that have been most successful, the ones that we've watched over time, include both the key leaders in our towns. They include, and it doesn't necessarily have to have all of them, but it has the key leaders in our institutions, whether it's our schools, our cities, our libraries, our law enforcement, our civic groups, our businesses, and communities who have been targeted, and diverse community members who feel this, and they have to be, along with ordinary residents, people in religious groups, parent groups, neighborhood groups, all working together in a shared mission, right? And that's harder to do than you would think, right? It's hard. It's a real challenge because people who have power want to hold on to it, and they're used to holding on to it, right? Mm-hmm. And people who don't have power quite often get into this understandable position where we can only affect change if we are in protest, when it's also possible to make change in other ways, right? There are multiple ways that you make change in a community, right? Sometimes protest is the way to go, and you need to highlight what's happening. Sometimes it is working together with some key leaders who share your ideas and just moving the needle on things that need to change. So there are a variety of ways that I think groups can function and need to function. And so often in groups, like you'll look at some of the groups that work with Not in Our Town, there's a Black Lives Matter group, and there's a Black Lives Matter group that has members that are both in Not in Our Town and are also in the Black Lives Matter group. And sometimes the Not in Our Town group can be a conduit or a way to reach some other folks that Black Lives Matter is not necessarily, like the police, for example. And so there are multiple ways to function for Not in Our Town groups. If I'm getting ahead of myself, please forgive me. But
no, I mean, I was going to actually ask, because I think for a lot of people, they don't even know where to start. So I know, for Not in Our Town, you all have 5 kind of simple steps to action that can help people realize, how they can start preventing violence and fighting racism, in their communities. So can you explain those action steps that you're referring to actually a little bit more in detail for our listeners?
Yes. So if you go onto NIOT.org or Not in Our Town and put 5 quick actions on Google, Not in Our Town, you'll find them, but I'll go through them. And I think, ultimately, every single one of these actions are about us showing up for each other, right? For us moving out of our both comfort zones and our complacency, right? Or our own fears, right? Our own fears that if I don't say anything, even if I feel this harm, if I don't say anything, it won't get any worse. Or if I'm watching this, someone's going to target me if I say. There are a lot of obstacles. These are real, right? They are real. And we can hide behind them. Each of us in our own way, we can hide behind them or we can push through them. And pushing through them, when you see that feeling, that relief of pushing through it, It's so tremendous, right? Especially when you find others. And I think that's the essential part in why Not in Our Town exists. None of us can fight this on our own. We can't. I mean, we all have to be brave. We all have to find courage, but our strength is in numbers and in working to stop hate together, right? So the 5 steps, okay. So 1 is make your values visible. This is like, okay, who am I? You start with a yard sign, right? There's some on our site. You just print it and put it out, and then people start talking to you. It's like, this is who we are. It's best if you have a group and you all agree about what the sign is going to be, and people start talking about it. And there are multiple layers of how you can get this signage out, but it's a way to begin. So in our communities after Charlottesville, 2017, there were a whole series of really horrific clashes in the street. White supremacists started coming to the Bay Area and marching through the streets of our towns. And then there were sometimes groups that would fight them. And the mayor of Berkeley, California, who and his chief of staff were standing on the steps, and they said, there has to be something for the average person to do, because I know we're all feeling this. We have to do something. And so they started printing these Bay Area United Against Hate signs, and they started putting them all over. And they're everywhere. They're everywhere. You go in the Bay Area and you will see them everywhere. And that became built such a sense of safety and relief for so many people, and then helped build the United Against Hate Week movement that we do every year. And I hope people, whoever's listening to this, will become involved in United Against Hate Week later this year. But signage, don't underestimate it. Signage is something. It's not going to stop the problem of hate, but it's a way to begin, right? Okay, so next, it's like, talk about how to stand up. Just having those discussions. I remember there's a group that was forming in Southern California, and there's a woman who got up and said, you know what I did after I saw that movie? It's called Not in Our Town, Manhattan Beach. You might want to check it out. Again, Google it, Not in Our Town, Manhattan Beach. She said, my husband and I went out on date night, and we started talking about it. And we talked about racism in our town, and we realized that we never really had this conversation before. Mm-hmm. And then we went home and talked to our kids about it. And then we invited our neighbors over, and we started having this conversation. And so it opened up this discussion, and it led to this other discussion that became equally powerful. Then we invited our friends, Latinx couple, and they said, I'm sorry, we're not moving to your town. We don't feel safe there, which opened up this whole reason and need to, this is why we have to do this work. You open a discussion. You are brave with one person, and then another, and another, and you start talking. The need for change becomes more apparent, and then the force of change becomes more powerful, right? So I think that's the next part. You start talking about it, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, but using our films to prompt a discussion. So it's not just, hey, let's just get together and talk about racism. That doesn't always work, right? Yeah. Let's have, I think that's tough, right? So using the story from one community to begin a discussion about your own is one of the deep lessons of Not in Our Town. The problems in Pittsburgh or Orlando or wherever you are very different than those in some other communities, but one town can learn from another. So next, take the pledge. So some communities are building these pledges, and we have sample pledges on our site that basically says, I am pledging to stand up when I see hate, when I witness it, when I see someone else being harmed. And this is harder, and you can't always ask people to do this, but when I am harmed myself, right? That is the tougher question, when I am harmed. How do I stand up for myself, or how do I ask for support from someone else? And that is not something that I think any of us we can't lay that responsibility on those who are harmed, right? But I know that I am so grateful to people who find that courage to speak up. But we can't make it their responsibility. We can't make it the responsibility of those who are harmed. But find a way to take that pledge. And I think, it seems like a simple thing. I've got this pledge, but Bloomington, again, a town that worked at this for a long time, this group would go to the school every year as parents and kids were registering for school. And they'd say, let's take the pledge against racism. Like you're registering for school, and the Not in Our Town group had a table, and they said, let's take the pledge. And when I went back to screen a film that we did about the attack on the Sikh temple of Wisconsin, the projectionist, who's an adult now, right, comes up to me and he goes, yeah, I took the pledge when I was in middle school, and I still have it. It's on my dresser now at home, right? So all these many years later, he sees that every day, right? He sees that. He remembers it. And I think part of the problem is that we do not give each other opportunities to think about this and to act on it. So something as simple as a pledge, it's like, oh yeah, that's lip service. You know what? Mm-hmm. It can be meaningful. It's meaningful if we make it meaningful, right? And then, these are getting progressively more difficult. Then start a Not in Our Town group or connect with a group that already exists in your community and say, what can we do together? Because you have to systematize it, right? Like, of course you want individuals taking these actions. But if you really want change in your town, it requires systemic change. And you have to start working on these projects together and really sort of investigating and looking at what you can do together. And so how to start a Not in Our Town group, again, on our website, you can go and unpack it. I was just counseling someone from Laguna Beach yesterday about, how do I begin? It's like, boom, just start. Here's some advice. We're doing a new resiliency guide, too, that should be up soon, about how to do this in these very difficult times. And I think understanding the history of intolerance and racism and hate in our own community is very much a part of that. So, and then stand up to hate groups. But, not every community has a hate group, hopefully, operating in their town. But there are hateful incidents and attacks, right? And you have to take them on, and you have to find a way to do this when it happens. Silence is acceptance, right? That is a message. If you allow these groups to operate without responding and without really saying, this is not who we are, not in our town, without saying that, then you're allowing them to operate. So, those are 5 quick things that it took me 10 minutes to say, but those are things, those are ways to begin.